quite a few questions about my last video on how I organized layout code in Swift, so I thought I would follow up on that and address a couple of the common ones. So in this video, we're going to look at some examples of how the view communicates with the view controller, how the view controller communicates back to the view, and some ways that you can segue or transition to the next screen in your flow if you want to organize things like I have described here. So first, the view to view controller communication. In the last video, I sort of brushed over this, saying that I would just use delegation. But after talking with a few people, I realized that seeing some specific examples would be helpful for people who are learning. So let's look at what that could look like in this login stack view from last time. This is where we're starting, basically where the last video ended. The first thing we need to do is define a delegate protocol for this login stack. That's going to look like this. We're going to make a protocol called login stack view delegate. We're going to constrain it to any object, which means only reference types can conform to this protocol. The reason we need to do that is so that we can hold a weak reference to it in the login stack and we don't get a retain cycle. And let's just start with a function. So we're going to tell our delegate when the user taps submit. Then in our login stack, we need to hold a delegate. So we're going to have a weak variable called delegate. Since it's weak, it has to be optional. But that's all we need there. Then we need a function for our button to call. This has to be exposed to Objective-C. And all we're going to do in here is tell our delegate that the user did tap submit. Then we need to add this as the action, the target action for our button. So in configure, we just need to say submit button, add target, self action, selector, submit tapped. For touch up inside. That means when the user lifts their finger off the screen while it is within the bounds of the button, we will call this method, which is just passing up to our delegate. Next, we need to go up to the login view, because this will be the delegate for the login stack in this case. And we need to do basically the exact same thing. We're just going to define a delegate protocol for the login view. It needs to be any object. And it's going to have the same function. Then it needs a delegate. And in configure, we need to set the login view as the login stack views delegate. So we're going to say login stack.delegate equals self. And then we need to conform to that delegate protocol. Right now, if we tried to build, it would say you can't do that because it's not a login stack view delegate. So we can adopt it, and it's still not going to let us build because we don't have all the required functions. But in here, we're going to tell the login views delegate that we tap submit. Again, here we're just passing the message on up to the whoever owns this login view. Now, you could just expose the delegate directly to whoever owns this, the delegate for the login stack view. But I prefer to do it this way because it's possible that this view has some information that we need to add into this method, or something, maybe it needs to transform the data in some way or whatever. So it's cleaner and your code will be more resilient, less coupled together if you have a delegate protocol for each layer of these views. But so now that we have that, we can go to our view controller, and in here we're going to we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say content view dot delegate equals self, and again that won't build because our view controller has not conformed to that protocol, but we'll do that right now. Still won't build. We can add the stubs. And in here, we're just going to print and eventually we'll come back and we'll handle what happens of it. Here, the view controller will contain the logic for what happens when the user hits submit. So let's run that, make sure we got everything, and if we hit login, we should see the print to the console that the user hit submit. So all of our delegates are working properly, and the information is being passed up to the view controller who's printing this statement. So we have the chain connected. The next thing we need to do is pass up the information that is necessary to submit a login. Right now, all we know is that the user hit the login button. We don't have any other information, but to log in, we need the username and password. So we're just going to pass that along in the delegate method. So what we're going to do is go to the login stack view. We're going to change the signature to say username. We're going to give an optional string, and password is also going to be an optional string. Then in did tap submit, we can say username is our username field dot text, and the password is the password field dot text. So that works, except for this won't build now because now our login view doesn't conform to that method. Hold on, I'm just going to copy this because we're going to use this same information in a bunch of places. So now this did tap submit needs to have these. So now we should build again. That's great. But so now we need to add that information to this protocol. So I'll paste it in there, paste it in here, and we just need to again pass up the information that we get. And now we can't build because now this view controller does not conform to that protocol. And now it does. Okay, so now we have the information we're going to need. We need to check that it's valid information. So I'm going to add this guard statement to unwrap these things. We're going to say let username equal username. So there's something there. We also need to check that the username is not empty, because we don't want an empty string. And we're going to do the same thing with password. So there we go. So we're going to unwrap these, check that they're not empty, and if any of those fail, we're going to print that we don't have all the required information. Otherwise, let's throw in some string interpolation here. This is not a thing you would want to do in a production app. Because then you're printing the person's username and password to the console, which could be logged somewhere or saved or whatever. So obviously this is not a thing you would want to do in real life, but just to make sure things are working here, we're going to try it. So if we hit login with empty, we don't have all the required info. If we have both, we see them get printed. So we're getting here. So that's good. We have all the information that we need at the view controller level, but I think we can clean this up a little bit. Right now we're passing a parameter for each piece of information we have, which is fine when we only have 2 pieces of information, but what if this was a form that had 10 fields or 20 fields? The delegate methods would get kind of ridiculous. Also, we're having to do all of this unwrapping here in the view controller and anywhere else that needs to conform to this delegate protocol. We'll have to do all this unwrapping at that layer. So for the sake of this example, I'm going to assume that if we don't have some string for the username and some string for the password, we're not even going to attempt to make a login try. So what we're going to do is wrap up all of this stuff into a struct, move it into the model layer, basically, which we haven't really talked about much in the previous video. But we're going to make a model for this information. It's not like our apps model, but it's just a convenient way to wrap up this information to pass it around. So what we're going to do is define a struct. And I'm going to define it in the file with the login stack view because it kind of lives. The login stack view is the view that's creating these login infos and passing them to other people. But it could go in its own file. It could live somewhere else. It doesn't really matter. That's just what we're going to do for this. So, and it needs to have a username and a password. And you see we're making these non-optional. So we'll check that we have all the things that we need in the initializer. So we're going to make a failable initializer that takes a username, which is an optional string, and a password, which is also an optional string. And we're going to take this unwrap statement, or this guard statement, and use that as kind of the basis for our failable initializer, except for we're going to return nil. So this is doing all the same checks. It's just doing it in the initializer for login info. And if we get through that and we have a valid username and password, we're just going to set self.username equal to username and self.password equal to password. Cool. So now all we need to do is update our delegate methods. So we're going to start here. We're going to say login info. It's going to take a login info. And this will be optional because this is a failable initializer. But basically what we're communicating here is either you have a login info that has all the pieces that you need to try to log in, or you have nil, meaning the user tried to submit and didn't provide all the necessary information. So there's only 2 options here instead of there being 4 things that we need to check for. So then we're going to take this, pull it out. We're going to say let login info equal login info. Conveniently, the signature is exactly the same. And so I can just paste that, and then we're going to pass that login info up to the delegate. Now again, this won't build because we're not conforming. So again, I'm just going to take this and copy it because we'll reuse it. Cool. That gets us up to that layer, and then at the view controller we need to do the same thing. Cool. And then in our guard statement, all we need to do is say let login info equal login info, else we don't have all the required info. Then here we can say login info dot username. Cool. So now if we run that again, we'll see the same thing. Don't have all the required info. If we put something here, then we'll get to this print statement. Cool. So now that's a lot cleaner. We're passing up all of our information in one struct instead of in one parameter, instead of it being split out into multiple. And now this is nice and clean. We do our check to make sure that we have all the required information at the point where this is initialized, and this is all wrapped up again in one place so we can see how it works in one spot. So now we should probably communicate something to the user. Right now we're just printing to the console, which doesn't tell the user anything. We need to look at how the view controller will communicate back to the view. But we'll start in the view again. So the first thing we're going to do is add a label to our view. And this is going to be, I'm going to put it in between the fields and the button. So I tend to define things kind of in the order that they lay out on the screen, just because I think that's nice. You can put it wherever you want. So we just need a label, and then same deal in configure. I'm going to configure in between the password field and the submit button because that's where it's going to go. So we need some text. So we're going to say we're going to label that text. We are going to set the number of lines to 0, so this can expand. If we're on a smaller device, it might take 2 or 3 lines. On a larger device, it might take less. We don't really care. It has plenty of room to expand, so we're just going to set it to 0. We're going to set the text alignment to center. We're going to set the text color equal to system red, and we're going to set the font to the preferred font for callout. This I came to just by trying things out, seeing how it looks. Another thing we're going to do is have this hidden by default. But one thing I do when I'm working on my views is comment that out so that I can run it and see what it looks like. Oh, we haven't added it to the view yet. So in a minute, we'll see what it looks like. So then we need to add it into the stack view after the password field. And we need to set its edge anchors or horizontal anchors. Okay, so now we should see it. Boom. Okay, so this is what it looks like on this device. I think that's fine. Good enough to demonstrate how this works. So now we're going to hide it by default. So now we should be back to our normal. Okay. Okay, so now we need a way to show it. So I'm just going to define a function called show warning. Probably in real life you would want a way to hide this again, but for now I only care about showing it. So I'm going to check if it is hidden because if it's already visible, I don't need to show it. It's already showing. And then we're just going to animate it in. So we're going to say UI view.animate. With duration 0.3. And here we're going to say self.warning label that is hidden equals false. So this will unhide the warning label and I'll animate it in so everything else kind of moves out of the way nicely. Now we have our label and a function that we can call that will show it. But how do we get access to that in the view controller? One way you could do this is basically the opposite of the delegate chain that we've created, where you could make a method in login view that will call login stack.show warning. And then in the view controller, you could say content view.show warning, and it would pass it back down to the view. And that'll work fine. As your view hierarchy gets more complex, that can get kind of messy. So another way that I've seen done well is similar to what Apple does with a lot of its APIs from UIKit. And that is to pass a reference to this login stack view in the delegate method. So that way in the view controller, we can just call the method directly on the login stack that called did-tab submit. In this case, that's just convenient. But one other advantage that gives is then in this did-tab submit method in the view controller, you know which login stack started the chain. If there are multiple of them on screen or whatever, then it's helpful to know sometimes which one called the delegate method. So that's what we're going to do. So first, what we're going to do is add another parameter to this delegate method, which is going to be login stack, which is going to be a login stack view. And I'm hiding the parameter label here just because Apple does that in a lot of their APIs as well. It makes it look a little nicer. So you don't have login stack constantly. Okay, so now we need to, in our delegate method, say self. So we're going to pass whatever instance we're in of login stack view to this delegate method. And now our app will refuse to build again because now we're not conforming to this. So we need to say login stack. There we go. So that'll build, but then we need to add it to this other delegate method. And here we need to say login stack. So that'll get passed up. And now it still won't build because we need to add that here. And now it will build and we can use it. So instead of printing, we're going to say login stack. Login stack.show warning. Cool. So now we can hit login and our warning gets shown if you don't provide the necessary information. Cool. So that's great. Nice and convenient. Shows our little warning there. And that should give you a pretty good idea of kind of the way that I think about this interview communication, where anytime I need to add a feature or something, I think about how do I need to display it in the view, and then how do I get the information I need to make decisions about it in the view controller where it can make that decision. So that's great for things within a specific view or within a specific screen, I guess. But how do we get from this screen to the next one? Now, if you're used to storyboards, you will probably reach for a segue. That's what most people are used to and what they are familiar with. But I'll just show like the basic way here to do it programmatically to present the next view. And then we will go briefly into the concept of a coordinator. This was first posited by Sarush Kanlu in the area of iOS, at least. And I'll link to his video on the topic in his blog post in the description. But before we get there, let's just look at the simple, naive way to do it from the view controller. So what we need to do is just first add a couple views that will present in these. These are not going to be like real views that we care about. They're not going to look super nice or fancy or anything, but it'll just give us something to transition to. Here, I'm just going to copy this because the code is virtually identical. And I'm going to copy this. And I'll just define the view in the same file just so it's all together. It's not going to be anything interesting that we haven't already seen. Cool. So now we have a logged in view controller. That seems like it'll build just fine. And I'm just going to copy this whole thing and duplicate it essentially to make a failed login view controller. And cool. So now we have two views that we can present. These obviously are not interesting or complex views, but just to demonstrate the concept of the transitions. I'm going to close them because we don't need to see them anymore. And the next thing I'm going to do is add an authenticator. So in your app, if it's possible to log in, you're probably going to have some sort of abstraction around authentication. And it will definitely look different than this one, but the interface to it will not be that different. You're going to give it some information that it needs to authenticate, and it will tell you if that was successful or not. So I'm just making a simple one here so that we can abstract that away. I'm going to make it a singleton. for ease of use while we're messing around with stuff, it's going to have a function that is called authenticate user with login info. Now we'll return a Boolean if it's successful or not. For now, we're just going to return if the login info username is longer than 4 characters and the password is 1234. Obviously, not a great authentication method, but it's enough that we can test stuff with. So now back in our view controller, I'm going to close Authenticator. Back in our view controller, we can check if the user's login attempt is successful. I'm going to get rid of this print and comment. So we get our login info. We're going to say is logged in equal authenticator. I need to build. There we go. Shared authenticate user with login info. And if is logged in, we will show a logged in view controller, sender self, else we will show failed login view controller. Cool. So our logic is pretty easy to read here in the view controller, nice and clean. We can see if we don't supply anything, we'll get this warning. If we supply a password that's too short, we'll get unable to log in. And if we give it the right requirements, we should, greater than 4. There we go. Log in successfully. Let's make this equal to. Cool. So that's great. It's presenting our next view. Here, show is showing this modally because we're not in a navigation controller, which is probably not what we want. And it's keeping the login stack behind it, so we can go back, which again is probably not what you want when you log in. It probably is what you want if you are showing the user some view describing why they were unable to log in. So that's kind of a problem. It's not going full screen and we still can go back. Neither of those are things that we want. So what we're going to do instead is replace the root view controller of the window, which will do what we want, but is kind of difficult to do from the view controller layer because it's not really designed for you to be able to do that from a view controller. The first thing we need to do is grab the scene delegate. So we're going to say guard let scene delegate equal the UI application shared instance, the connected scenes. The first one, and I know that this is safe to do because this application can only have one scene at a time. So it should always be the right one. We can grab the delegate. We can cast it as a scene delegate because that is our custom subclass. Here, we need to grab the window from the scene delegate. Else, we'll just present the same way we have been. Probably you could crash here and that'd be fine too. This should never happen under normal circumstances. And then what we need to do is say window.root view controller equals the logged in view controller. and we're going to do this transition from UI view with the window. We'll take 0.3 seconds. We're going to use transition flip from right. We don't need any animations and we don't need any completion. So those can just be no. Now, oh, we need to return here. That still works. Test 1, 2, 3, 4. When we hit login, it should flip over and you can't go back anymore to the login, which is great. That's what we want. Okay. One other thing that's kind of cool here is we can check if we're getting rid of this original view controller in the deinitializer. We can just print let's try that out. There you go. See, when we make that transition, we actually get rid of that. So we're not hanging on to it in memory, wasting resources on the user's device, which is great. There are a bunch of different options here that you can use. I just used this flip from right. I think there's a cross dissolve, probably. Yeah. There's curl up, curl down, cross dissolve, flip from any side that you want. Whatever. There's lots of options. You can pick what works for you or don't use any at all. This works. It's kind of messy because we're doing all this weird reaching into other parts of the app from this view controller to make sure there's something there that we can do something with. I don't love that. There is also another problem here that this view controller is tied to the view controllers that follow after it. And often an app, you want to make changes. Maybe you want to A/B test or do something with a feature flag, or maybe the user hit a deep link that should take them to specific content, but they need to log in first. So they need to log in and then show them that content next instead of going to the normal root view. And that is possible to do in this structure, but it gets real complicated and messy in this did tap submit method, or wherever you're presenting the next view controller from this view controller. And then this view controller has to know about all of the possible view controllers that it can go to, and it gets real messy. And I don't love that we're doing all this stuff to get to the window. So to clean that up, we're going to introduce a coordinator. Like I said, the first place I heard about these was from Sarush Kanlu. I don't know if he invented the concept or not, but I think he did. They've become a lot more popular in the last few years. Anyway, so there's a good chance you've already heard of it. But I'm just going to show how I would use a coordinator in this instance to clean some of this up, and kind of generally how I organize coordinators when I use them. So the first thing we need to do is add another file that will hold our coordinator. And this is going to be a class. Doesn't need a superclass. It needs to hold a reference to the window. You don't have to do this, but for my top level coordinator, I usually do, just because it makes it easier to make transitions like I just showed you. And we're also going to have a view controller that we hold on to here. Oh, and we need to import UIKit. There we go. In our initializer, we're going to pass a window reference. So that works. Okay, and then the other thing we need is a start method. So whoever makes this coordinator will call the start method when it's ready to start the coordinator's flow. So first thing we need to do here is switch up our authenticator a little bit. I'm going to add a convenience property here called, this is going to be a private set variable called isLoggedIn. And it's going to equal false by default. Then here we just need to say isLoggedIn equals this, and return isLoggedIn. So in a real app, you could maybe have multiple functions that would authenticate your user, but only one piece of state that holds whether they're not logged in or not. So again, this doesn't really matter, but that's what we're going to do for now. So here we're going to check if authenticator.shared.isLoggedIn. We're going to show them the logged in view controller. Otherwise, we're going to show them the login view controller, the view controller that we started with here. Probably we should rename this. Actually, let's go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to rename all the references to this to be login view controller. So it's clear what it's doing. Then we need to say our Windows root view controller equals the view controller. And we need to make the window key and visible. Cool. Pretty simple. We're just going to check if we're logged in. If we're already logged in, we don't need to show the login view controller. We can just go straight to whatever the first view is. And if we're not logged in, we can show the login flow. Then we'll take that and put it in the window. Super convenient, and it's nice that the user will just start the app. The first thing they see after the launch screen will be whatever is the most relevant to them based on the state. So now we need to go to the scene delegate and make some updates here. I don't think we need any of this other stuff. The thing we care about is this will connect to session function. And we need to hold a coordinator here. Okay, we need to actually hold on to this variable. So we're going to say window, we're going to call this window scene because we're casting it as a window scene. Then we need to make a window. With that window scene. Then we're going to make our coordinator equal to a coordinator with that window that we just made. We will hold on to the window in the scene delegate. I don't know that this is really necessary, but if something else needs to access it, we'll have a reference to it here too. And then we tell our coordinator to start. So there, now that we have those little bits of code, we should be using our coordinator, and we can check that by, if we default is logged into true, we should see the logged in view when we first run the app. Boom, look at that. So one convenient piece of this is that we can now get rid of the main storyboard if we want to. We don't actually need this anymore. So I'm going to get rid of it. We need to pull it out of the info plist because that will crash our app currently. The scene manifest, scene configuration, session role, item 0. We need to say storyboard name. We get rid of that. I think if we get rid of those two things, our app will still run. There we go. Without Main.storyboard. So now, other than the launch screen, everything is programmatically initiated in our app, which is great. We can close this out. We can go back to the coordinator. So now we need to do our login logic. So that's what we were actually trying to get out of the login view controller. I don't know why it's not showing that to me. But so we're basically going to pull all of this out by, again, using a delegate method. So, or a delegate protocol. So we're going to define a protocol called login view controller. It's again going to be any object. And it is going to have a function called attempt login with login info. Cool. There we go. Now we need to have a delegate. Cool. And then here we just need to say delegate. We attempted login with this login info. We can, I'm gonna not get rid of this yet, but copy it, cut it to my clipboard. Now our did tap submit function is nice and clean. And notice here that, like, this is obviously a pretty simple example, but we're checking that we have all the information that we need to get from this view. And if we don't, we're still within the jurisdiction of this view controller. So we just tell our view what to do to give the user more information. So we're staying internal to the view controller. This view controller is making decisions about things that go on inside of this view controller. And then when we're ready to move on, we have all the information we need. We're just giving that to our delegate, which will be the coordinator. So now in our coordinator, we need to set the delegate of the login view controller. So we're going to say let login VC equal login view controller. Cool. And that shouldn't build because we don't conform, to that protocol. So we need to have an extension on coordinator. Login view controller delegate. We can get the stubs. And I'm just going to paste this in what we had before. We can clean this up because we have a reference to window, we don't need any of this. We can just do that. And then our view controller can show the next login, can show the next view controller. And that should mostly work, except one thing we need to do is, instead of just assigning this directly to be the root view controller of the window, we need to not hold on to it here anymore, because currently when we get to this point, the login view controller is the view controller of this coordinator. And if we just assign the next view to the window, we're still holding on to that original login view controller in this coordinator, which we don't want to do. So what we actually want to do here is say view controller equals logged in view controller, and window root view controller equals view controller. Now, I think that should all work. We should be all hooked up. Let's try it. Boom, we're logged in successfully, and we still deinitialized that old view controller. So that's great. There you go. That is a simple coordinator. One thing that is very convenient about this is we can do whatever we want in this delegate method. We can initialize whatever view controller we want. It could be based on a feature flag. It could be based on an API call. It could be based on a URL. We can go wherever we want from this place and have our logic contained in the coordinator instead of in the view controller. You could even make another coordinator from this coordinator and call its start function and have it make decisions. Here, though, all we're doing, again, is just initializing our own view controller and setting it and transitioning there. So this is a very simple example, but this method of organizing things, putting the logic for transitioning between views into a coordinator, really cleans up your view controllers, and it really decouples them so that you can go from one view controller to whatever view controller next. And that decision, you have a place to make that decision. We covered a lot of ground here today. We looked at how I have my views communicate with their view controllers. We've looked at how I have those view controllers communicate back to their views. And we've looked at a couple of ways you can organize the logic for the flows between screens. I hope, as always, that this has been helpful and maybe given you an opportunity to think about how you organize your own code. If you have any questions or suggestions, comments, whatever, throw them down in the comments. I'm happy to read them, and I'm happy to help if you need any help with anything. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.